Hi, welcome back. We're continuing on in Chapter 3, talking about plants. And we're in pages 65 to 67, and we're going to be covering classifying today in this lesson. In order to classify something or to have classification or classifying, the root word is, and we can underline that in red, the root word is class. And when we think of the word class, we think of a group of people. And usually when we have a class of students, it means that all the students in there are the same age. Therefore, they are a class or a group of people. As we continue on, if we want to practice classifying in the classroom, we can practice by dividing the groups. Maybe some wear glasses and some do not wear glasses. So you can put those in two groups. You just classified that group farther, but because of their similar characteristics. Some are wearing glasses and some are not. Another could be boy or girl. Girls, boys. That's another way of classifying a group. And when we do that, we're grouping organisms that have similar characteristics. Grouping organisms that have similar characteristics. And characteristic just means what are the different things about that organism? Meaning, how big is it? How tall is it? What kind of food does it eat? Is it a carnivore or herbivore? Those are different characteristics about an organism. And so in this lesson, we're going to learn about classifying. Now we have some vocabulary words that we want to pay attention to. And as I say it, you go ahead and repeat this word, botanist. Botanist. B-O-T-A-N-I-S-T, just in case you can't see. Spore. Spore. And the word conifer. Let's say that, conifer. The last one. This one is not really a vocabulary word, but it's something I want you to compare to this word, conifer. This word is deciduous. One more time, deciduous. Okay, so let's go ahead and learn how or different ways we can classify plants. Let's go ahead and begin reading. A botanist is a scientist who studies plants. He might compare them to find out what parts are alike. Then he may put the plants that are alike into a group. Grouping things that have similar characteristics or things that are alike is called classifying. Scientists classify things to make them easier to study. So, a scientist who studies plants, and there are many different kinds of scientists, but one kind of scientist who studies plants, they are called a botanist. A botanist. Anytime that we're talking about science, usually, when you see IST at the end, that's talking about a person. For instance, a scientist, a botanist, a chemist, a physicist. When it has an IST, that's talking about the person who is studying. Let's continue on. I apologize. So in order for botanists to make studying plants easier, they classify these different plants or put them into groups, and in each group they have things that are similar about that group. Maybe they grow the same height, or maybe they have the same kind of flower, or maybe they have the same kind of fruit. All different things. They put them into groups that have similar things about them or characteristics. So in this lesson we're going to learn 3 ways how botanists classify plants. Now there are many more ways, and I promise you in level 6 we're going to learn many more ways to classify plants. But in level 4 we're just learning about 3. So the first one is tubes or no tubes. One way botanists classify plants is by whether or not the plants have tubes in them. Tubes inside the plant move water from the roots to the other parts of the plant. Tubes also carry dissolved food throughout the plant. Most types of plants have tubes. However, some plants, such as moss, do not have tubes to move water. Instead of moving water in tubes, these plants soak up water like a sponge. Moss must live in moist areas to get the water it needs. Some types of mosses grow on rocks or trees in humid climates. Moss usually does not grow very tall. Each plant may be only a few millimeters high. But there are usually many of these plants growing together. So what is the first way? Tubes or no tubes. Tubes or no tubes. Now later on when you're in 6th grade, we're going to call that the vascular system. And it's kind of similar to all of the veins in your body that move oxygen in your blood and nutrients throughout your body. It's the same thing in a plant, and most, not all, most of them have these tubes inside of them, and it goes from the root all the way to the very top of the plant. It moves water from the roots through the plant, because all of the plant needs water. Also moves nutrients from the ground. There are different minerals in the ground that the plants need. And also, remember, another way that plants get food is through photosynthesis. And so at the end of photosynthesis, it makes sugar. And so these tubes, or the vascular system, move sugar throughout the plant to keep it healthy. Now, you can think of a tube as like a straw. When you take a drink from a cup of water, or maybe you go to McDonald's and you get a soda, and you put a straw in it, and you suck up that liquid through the straw. It's kind of like when we learned in chapter 2 about insects and spiders. Remember that mosquito, and it pokes you in the skin, and it sucks the blood through the proboscis? Well, that's kind of the similar thing here in a plant. Now, I know this is not a very good picture, but this is my rendition of a piece of celery, and you can try this at home. If you take a piece of celery, you ask Mom's permission first, and you cut the end of it, you'll see all around the edge of the celery these little tiny holes. Those are the tubes inside the plant that moves water and nutrients through the plant. Now, to see it even better, if you cut it off and you put it in colored water, maybe after 1 day or so, you can see the colored water all the way through the plants. And if you cut very carefully along the long side, you can cut away and pull away each one of those tubes and look at it, and you can see the colored water through the tube. Again, tubes or no tubes. Well, it mentions another plant in here called moss, and you may have seen that maybe if you went to a river or a pond or a lake and you see the rocks next to the water. Many times those rocks are covered with a kind of greenish, almost looks like a carpet, and that is called moss. Now, some moss that we'll learn in level 6, some do grow very tall, but most of them do not. They're very, very tiny. Why? Because they don't have those tubes in here. So not only do these tubes move water and nutrients to the plant, but it also gives the plant gives it strength and support, kind of almost like its skeleton system, like you have in your body. So plants like celery, plants like a tree, they can grow very tall because of their vascular system or their tubes. But since these plants don't have tubes, like the moss, they can't grow very tall. They don't have the strength to grow very tall. So, well, how do they get water? They're an organism. All plants need organisms, all plants need water. All organisms need water. Well, you think of a sponge when it comes to moss. And what does a sponge do when you put it in water? Well, it absorbs that water. And that's exactly what moss does. And there are other plants that absorb water from the air. You might not think of water being in the air, but there is. You just don't see it. It's called vapor. And it's very important that there's vapor in the air, not only to keep our skin moist, but it also gives water to these plants that don't have vascular tubes or do not have tubes. So moss, think of the word sponge, and they absorb water from the air, from the vapor. All right, let's go on. So the first one, tubes or no tubes. Let's continue on. Another way botanists can classify plants is whether or not they produce seeds. Moss plants reproduce without seeds. They reproduce using spores. A spore is a spore, I can't speak today. A spore is smaller than a seed and does not have any stored food. Small structures at the top of the moss plants hold the spores. When the structures burst open, they scatter the spores. The spores land on the ground and can begin to grow. Ferns also use spores to reproduce. The underside of a fern often has small spots. These small spots contain tiny spores. When mature, or when they're an adult, these spores can drop to the ground, and each spore can produce another plant. Unlike moss, ferns have tubes to move water inside the plant, but most ferns still grow in moist, shady places. Spores germinate best, or begin to grow best, in these conditions. Now, we learned in the last lesson there are ways that you can grow a plant without using a seed, and I hope you got to try that at home. Remember, you can do a cutting, and then it will eventually grow a root. And then when the root is long enough, you can put it in soil, and you will have a whole new plant. Those are just one way. But there are also, like moss, they have what is called a spore. And it's similar to a seed, but it's different in two ways. One, it's much smaller than a seed. And then second, it doesn't have any cotyledons. Remember, seeds will either have one cotyledon or two, but spores do not have any stored food. Now, it doesn't matter if the plant is vascular or has tubes or doesn't have tubes. Some plants, they reproduce with seeds, and some reproduce with spores. So moss and this plant in your book on page 66, the fern, they reproduce using spores. And if you look at the second little picture, you'll see these little tiny pockets. And when it's just right, when it's an adult, those little pockets will burst open, and it will disperse or scatter those spores to the ground, and maybe they will germinate and grow into a new plant. So, first one, tube or no tubes. Second, does it reproduce using a seed or spore? The third one, flowers or cones. Let's continue on. Although some plants reproduce using spores, most plants produce seeds. However, plants that produce seeds do so in different ways. Botanists can classify these plants how they produce or make their seeds. Plants that produce seeds in a fruit are called flowering plants. These plants are all around you. In fact, more than half of the plants on the earth are flowering plants. Vegetable flowers and many trees are flowering plants. Many flowering plants lose their leaves once a year. Usually this happens after the growing season. In the fall, you may rake the leaves of a large tree. Though you rake the leaves up, the tree will grow new ones in the spring. Next fall, after the growing season, the raking will have to be done all over again. Not all plants produce seeds in a fruit. Some plants produce seeds in a cone. Plants that produce or make seeds in a cone are called conifers. Conifers may be shrubs, bushes, or trees such as pines and spruces. Conifers often have leaves that look like needles or fish scales. Most conifers keep their leaves all year long. Botanists classify their plants to organize thousands of different kinds. By placing the plants in groups, we can study them better. As we study, we are able to see the wonder of God's designs. He made each kind of plant, and each plant has exactly the features it needs to live and grow. Okay, so you have two different kinds of plants on page 67. The top one is a maple tree, and yes, that is considered a flowering plant. We usually don't see the flower, it's very, very tiny, but once the flower petals die off, you'll see this little seed, and usually when they fall, they spin around in a circle, kind of like a helicopter. Another good one, this is the easiest one to understand this, is an apple tree. If you've seen an apple tree, when it's in the springtime, it'll first grow the little leaves, and then it will begin to grow the little flowers. And then when it's time, those little flowers will begin to fall off, and where the flower was, it will begin to produce a fruit around the seed. Well, things like that and the maple tree, those are called flowering plants. So the third way we classify is whether does it make a seed in a flower or does it make a seed in a cone. So apple trees, they're the easiest way to remember a flowering plant. So it begins with a flower in the spring, the petals die off, a fruit grows, and in the fall when you pick it, then you'll know it is also a flowering plant, or what we call a deciduous. Can we say that? Deciduous. Deciduous. Because after we pick the fruit or the fruit falls off, also the leaves will fall down. You'll see that many apple trees will change to red or yellow or orange. Many of these trees will turn all these very beautiful different colors. And then eventually they fall to the ground, and either we rake it up or we just leave them there, and it will actually put nutrients into the soil. But not all plants reproduce seeds in a flower. Half of the plants on our earth do, and we can enjoy many of those fruits and eat them. But another way, like in your picture on page 67, they make a seed inside a cone. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of trivia. Do you know there are girl cones and boy cones? And we're going to learn more about that in level 6. But boy cones are usually at the top of the plant, and the girls are at the bottom. And the boy ones are usually smaller, and the girl ones that carry the seeds are usually larger. And what happens is when it's time to pollinate, they both open, and the top ones, the male, they will send out their pollen, and it will float down and go inside to the girl cone and germinate those seeds, or germinate the eggs inside to make seeds. And during the winter time, you can test this. If you go out and get a cone off of a tree, and you'll notice in the warm weather that probably the cone is open. But if you take that and you put it in the freezer, you give it about an hour, and all of the cone will close up because it thinks it's winter time and it's trying to protect that seed. So give that a test. So any plant that makes a seed inside a cone, and you hear almost the same 3 letters at the beginning, is a conifer. Okay? So a conifer is a plant that makes a seed inside a cone, or a pine cone. And there's an example of a cone in your book. Now, if you're thinking, I still don't know what a conifer is, Mrs. Johnson. Well, think of a Christmas tree. When you decorate a Christmas tree, what does it look like? That's an example of a conifer, or a pine tree, or a spruce tree. There are other conifers, but a conifer is any plant that makes a seed inside a cone. So let's review. What are the 3 ways of classifying? Tubes or no tubes, seeds or spore, conifer or flowering plant. And the flowering plant we can call deciduous. Deciduous. Okay, I wanted to ask you a quick question before about some of the projects you may have done. How is your germination plant? Did it germinate? Did you try both seeds? Did they both germinate? How is the one that was left in the dark? I apologize about the bell. I'm so sorry, that bell is very loud. And how tall did it grow? How healthy did it grow? But you can probably see that it doesn't need sunlight to germinate. Now, after this lesson, I apologize, just a second. My students will come in. Something you can do after this lesson is do a classifying project where you go and collect 10 different leaves, and you put your leaves in groups. And you can look on page 68 and 69, and also your activity manual 55 and 56. Now, some things you can do to practice this lesson that we learned about in classifying. There are 2 questions on page 67, and in your activity manual, there's page 53 and 54, which you can do for practice as homework. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time.